He knows exactly what is about to happen to him. That is the part people forget. Odysseus does not stumble into the sirens. He does not wander unprepared into the most dangerous stretch of water in the ancient world. He plans for it. He orders his men to fill their ears with wax so they cannot hear a single note. And then he does something stranger. He asks to be tied to the mast, hands bound, ropes wrapped tight around his chest. He tells his crew in advance exactly what is going to happen. He's going to hear the most beautiful sound in the world, a song no man has ever survived, and he is going to beg them to let him go. And he gives them one instruction. Whatever I say, do not untie me. This is not a story about a hero resisting temptation through sheer force of will. It is almost the opposite. Odysseus does not trust his own willpower for even a second. He does not believe, when the moment comes, that the man standing at that mast will be strong enough to say no. So he removes the choice entirely. Today. In advance. While he is still thinking clearly. Christopher Nolan's new film has put this scene back in front of millions of people, rendered at a scale Homer could never have imagined. But the mechanism inside that scene is not new, and it is not really about monsters or magic at all. It has a name in modern psychology and economics. Researchers call it a Ulysses Pact, and once you understand how it actually works, you start seeing it everywhere. In ancient armies, in modern retirement accounts, in the decision made by ordinary people every single day to protect their future selves from the person they are right now. The Odyssey itself sits on top of something real. For most of the 19th century, scholars treated Troy as pure invention. A beautiful story, certainly, not a place. Then, in 1870, a wealthy and controversial amateur archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann began digging into a mound in northwestern Turkey called Hizarlik, convinced that Homer had been describing an actual city. He found one. Then he found the layers beneath it. Then the layers beneath those. Archaeologists eventually identified at least 9 major settlements stacked on top of each other at that site, spanning thousands of years. One of the middle layers, now labeled Troy 7a, shows clear evidence of violent destruction dating to roughly the same period the ancient Greeks themselves believed the Trojan War had taken place. This period sits inside one of the most fragile windows in the entire ancient world, the Late Bronze Age. The same interconnected palace-based system of trade and diplomacy that collapsed almost entirely within a single generation, around 1200 BC, when every major power in the eastern Mediterranean seemed to destabilize at once. Troy did not fall in isolation. It fell inside the same wave that took the Mycenaean palaces, the Hittite capital, and a dozen smaller kingdoms whose names barely survive. Homer was not writing history in any modern sense. He was composing centuries after the fact, weaving oral tradition into verse. But underneath the gods and the monsters sits the memory of something that genuinely happened. A world of tightly bound trade routes and fragile alliances unraveling all at once. The man who allegedly commanded a fleet home from that unraveling world is remembered for one specific piece of wisdom. He did not trust himself. Set that scene aside for a moment and travel forward almost 3,000 years. To a beach on the eastern coast of Mexico in 1519. A Spanish expedition led by Hernán Cortés had just landed with a few hundred men facing an empire of millions. Many of his own soldiers were terrified. Several had already begun quietly planning to seize a ship and sail back to Cuba before the campaign had properly begun. Cortés's solution was almost identical to the one Homer gave his hero 7 centuries earlier. He ordered his own ships destroyed. Historians still debate the precise details, whether the vessels were burned outright or deliberately run aground and stripped for parts, but the strategic effect was the same either way. Retreat by sea was no longer physically possible. There was no ship left to steal, no harbor escape to fantasize about in a moment of fear. Every man on that beach now had exactly one direction available to him: forward. Cortés did not deliver a rousing speech convincing his men to feel brave. He did not need to. He simply removed the option that fear would have reached for before fear had the chance to reach for it. 2 commanders, separated by more than 2,000 years and an ocean neither could have imagined crossing, arrived independently at the exact same solution to the exact same problem. Neither of them trusted the version of himself that would exist in the moment of maximum pressure. So both of them made a decision today, while calm, that would bind the version of themselves who would not be calm tomorrow. This is precisely the mechanism modern researchers later gave a name to. The philosopher John Elster, writing extensively on the subject in the late 20th century, described these as pre-commitment devices. Deliberate constraints, built in advance, specifically designed to remove a choice before a weaker future, self gets the chance to make it badly. The insight underneath this idea is uncomfortable, because it cuts against almost everything modern culture tells us about willpower. We are taught to believe that self-control is a kind of internal strength, a muscle, something admirable people simply have more of than everyone else. Behavioral research tells a different story. The mind that exists in a moment of temptation, fear, or exhaustion is not simply a weaker version of your ordinary mind. In many meaningful respects, it is a different decision-making system entirely. Psychologists describe this as a conflict between a colder, more deliberate mode of thinking and a hotter, more impulsive one, activated specifically under stress, craving, or immediate reward. The version of you reading this sentence right now, calm and reflective, is not the same version of you that will exist at the exact moment a siren's song, or its modern equivalent, starts playing. Odysseus understood this instinctively. He did not ask his future self to be brave. He asked his present self to build a rope. This same logic sat, unnoticed, at the center of one of the most successful pieces of applied economics in modern history. By the early 2000s, American retirement savings were in serious trouble. Millions of workers offered voluntary retirement plans through their employers simply were not enrolling. Even among those who did enroll, contribution rates stayed stubbornly low year after year. Traditional economic theory struggled to explain this. People clearly wanted a comfortable retirement. Refusing to save for it, even when the option was freely available, appeared to be a simple failure of willpower repeated by millions of individuals simultaneously. Two economists, Richard Thaler and Shlomo Benartzi, suspected something else was happening. Not a failure of desire, a failure of timing. Asking someone to cut their spending today in the concrete, immediate present activates powerful resistance. Loss aversion, the same mechanism explored elsewhere on this channel, makes an immediate pay cut feel disproportionately painful, regardless of how clearly the future benefit is explained. So Thaler and Benartzi designed something closer to a modern version of a mast and a rope. They called it Save More Tomorrow. Employees were not asked to increase their retirement contributions today. They were asked to agree in advance that their contribution rate would automatically increase later, timed specifically to coincide with their next salary raise. The increase would come out of money the employee had not yet received, and therefore had not yet mentally claimed as their own. The present self made one small, low-friction decision. The future self inherited the consequence, automatically, without ever needing to find fresh willpower in the moment. The results published in a landmark study were extraordinary. At companies that adopted the program, average savings rates nearly quadrupled over the following years. Not because employees suddenly became more disciplined people, because the discipline had been built into the system in advance, at a moment when it was cheap and easy to commit, rather than left to be summoned later, at the exact moment it would be most expensive and most difficult. This same architecture now shows up in places far removed from ancient warships or retirement paperwork. Modern commitment devices have become an entire quiet industry. Apps that physically lock a smartphone away for a set number of hours, chosen and activated by the same user who will, later that evening, want desperately to unlock it early. Small lockboxes, timer-sealed, into which people place credit cards, phones, or car keys, precisely because they do not trust the version of themselves who will exist at 11 at night. Investors write themselves rules while markets are calm, specifically because they know panic makes poor decisions feel urgent and reasonable in the moment. Recovering addicts hand their car keys to a friend before attending an event where alcohol will be present, not because they lack insight into their own risk, but because they have exactly the right amount of insight into it. Every one of these tools follows the identical logic Homer gave his hero, and Cortez gave his soldiers. Do not trust the future version of yourself in the moment that matters most. Build the rope now while you still can. It is not really a story about ships or sirens or retirement accounts. It is a story about the fact that a single human being is not, in any meaningful sense, one continuous decision-maker. You are, across a single day, several different versions of a similar person, handing responsibility back and forth between each other. A calm morning version, negotiating on behalf of a stressed and depleted evening version, who has not been born yet. This channel began with a simple observation. History repeats itself because human nature does not change. Homer's audience already understood, 3,000 years ago, something modern behavioral economics needed elaborate studies and control groups to rediscover, that the strongest version of a person is not always the one standing at the moment of temptation. Sometimes the strongest version of a person is the one who plans, calmly, days or years in advance, for the arrival of a weaker one. Odysseus was not tied to that mast because he was weak. He was tied to it because he already knew with total clarity exactly how strong he was not going to be. The question worth sitting with is not whether you have enough willpower for whatever is coming. It is whether you have already built the rope.